September 1, 1939, 0445 hours, the Polish-German border. In the pre-dawn darkness, Polish soldiers manning defensive positions near Wielin heard something they would never forget, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of the sky itself. Not the drone of conventional bombers, not the whistle of artillery, something else entirely. A mechanical scream, rising, piercing, inhuman. Then they saw them, black shapes diving from 4,000 meters, plummeting toward Earth at angles that seemed physically impossible. The scream grew louder, more unbearable. 80 degrees, 85 degrees, nearly vertical. And then the explosions. Within minutes, Wielin, a hospital town with no military significance, was obliterated. 3/4 of the city destroyed, 1,200 civilians dead. World War II had begun. And so had the reign of terror of Germany's most psychological weapon, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The Allied soldiers who survived Stuka attacks reported something beyond conventional warfare. They described paralysis, the inability to move, to think, to function. Grown men, trained soldiers, reduced to trembling masses by a sound engineered in a laboratory. This is the story of how German engineers weaponized fear itself, how they built an aircraft that was technically obsolete before the war even began, yet terrorized entire armies. How a dive bomber with a maximum speed of just 390 kilometers per hour became one of the most feared weapons of World War II. The Stuka didn't just drop bombs, it shattered minds. Berlin, December 1933. The German Air Ministry, recently re-established in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, issued a classified specification. Requirement: close air support aircraft, capable of precision bombing. The specification seemed straightforward, but Ernst Udet, World War I fighter ace and newly appointed director of the technical office, had experienced dive bombing firsthand during a demonstration flight in America. He had witnessed a Curtiss Hawk II diving at a ground target, releasing its bomb with pinpoint accuracy. Udet returned to Germany obsessed with one concept: the vertical attack. Traditional horizontal bombing from altitude scattered ordnance across hundreds of meters. Even the best bombardiers achieved only 2 to 3% accuracy. But dive bombing, attacking at angles of 60 to 90 degrees, could place a bomb within a 25-meter radius. In military terms, this was revolutionary. The Junkers Company, led by chief designer Hermann Pohlmann, accepted the challenge. But Pohlmann understood something beyond the technical requirements. He understood psychology. Pohlmann's design philosophy: the aircraft must be a complete weapon system, not just a bomb delivery platform, a psychological instrument. The Junkers engineering team began work in early 1934. The aircraft that emerged bore the designation Ju-87. From the beginning, every design element served dual purposes: mechanical function and psychological impact. The inverted gull wings. Mechanically, they provided ground clearance for the fixed landing gear while keeping the gear legs short and strong. Psychologically, they created a predatory silhouette, like a bird of prey, unmistakable, threatening. The fixed landing gear with massive wheel spats. Mechanically inefficient, creating drag that limited top speed, but Pohlmann retained them deliberately. They enhanced the aircraft's aggressive appearance, and critically, they provided mounting points for something unprecedented. On September 17, 1935, test pilot Willy Neuenhofen lifted the Ju-87 V1 prototype from Dessau Airfield for its first flight. The initial trials revealed an aircraft with docile handling characteristics
excellent visibility from the greenhouse canopy, and remarkable stability in the dive. But something was missing: the psychological element. The engineering staff at Junkers consulted with Luftwaffe psychological warfare specialists. The question posed: how do you maximize enemy demoralization before weapons impact? The answer came from ancient warfare. The Mongols tied whistles to their arrows. Medieval armies used drums and horns to terrify opponents. The principle was timeless: auditory assault precedes physical assault. By 1936, Junkers engineers had developed the Jericho Trumpet, the Jericho Trumpet. Two small propeller-driven sirens mounted on the landing gear spats. As the aircraft dove, ram air spun the propellers, generating a rising mechanical shriek that reached 120 decibels at close range. The sound was specifically engineered, not random. The frequency increased as dive angles steepened and speed built. From 600 meters, soldiers heard a distant wail. At 300 meters, a scream. At impact, an apocalyptic howl that seemed to announce the end of the world. Initial Luftwaffe test reports noted, psychological effect on ground observers profound. Sound generates involuntary stress response. Personnel display reduced combat effectiveness during approach phase. In clinical terms, the Jericho Trumpet triggered the human brain's fear center before conscious thought could engage. It was weaponized panic. By 1937, the U-87B entered production with finalized specifications that would remain largely unchanged through the war's early years. Power plant: single Junkers UMO 211D engine, 12 cylinders in V configuration, liquid-cooled, 1,200 horsepower. This was not cutting edge. Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin produced similar power with better reliability, but the UMO 211 was proven, mass-producible, and adequate for the Stuka's mission profile. Maximum speed: 390 kilometers per hour at optimal altitude. In comparison, contemporary fighters exceeded 500 kilometers per hour. The Stuka was slow, deliberately. Speed wasn't its purpose. Combat radius: 600 kilometers with maximum bomb load. Sufficient for tactical support of ground forces, but inadequate for strategic bombing. The Stuka was never intended for deep strikes. It was a battlefield weapon, a flying artillery piece. Ordnance capacity: one centerline bomb station capable of mounting 500 or 1,000 kilogram bombs, 4 underwing hardpoints for 50 kilogram bombs. Total maximum load: 1,200 kilograms. Modest by bomber standards, but devastating when delivered with precision. The centerline bomb station featured an ingenious mechanical solution. When diving at steep angles, a conventional bomb release would send a bomb into the propeller arc. Junkers engineers designed an automatic trapeze arm that swung the bomb clear of the propeller before release. This mechanism, simple yet effective, was critical to the aircraft's success. Defensive armament: minimal. 2 forward-firing 7.92 mm MG-17 machine guns, 1 rear-facing 7.92 mm MG-15 for the radio operator/gunner. Against fighters, these weapons were nearly useless. The Stuka's defense was its dive performance and, theoretically, fighter escort. Crew: 2. Pilot in front, under the heavy-framed canopy with excellent downward visibility. Radio operator/rear gunner behind, operating the flexible machine gun and managing communications. The canopy was hinged to swing sideways, not lift up, critical for emergency egress during a dive. But the Stuka's true innovation lay in its dive characteristics. This is where German engineering philosophy revealed itself completely. Dive procedure: the pilot approached the target at 4,000 to 5,000 meters altitude. Upon identifying the target, he rolled inverted, literally flying upside down, then pulled through into a dive angle of 60 to 80 degrees. Some pilots achieved 90-degree vertical dives. At this angle, at speeds building toward 550 kilometers per hour, the Stuka's airframe began screaming mechanically. The Jericho sirens howled. The aircraft became a projectile guided by human hands. The pilot used a specialized bomb sight, the STUV dive sight mounted in front of him. Red lines etched on the windscreen, altitude indicators, release point markers. At precisely the correct moment, typically 700 to 450 meters altitude, the pilot pressed the bomb release. Then came the most dangerous moment: recovery. At these speeds, at these altitudes, pulling out of the dive subjected the pilot to enormous G-forces. Early Stuka models killed pilots who blacked out during recovery. Junkers engineers implemented an automatic pull-out system. The pilot set the recovery altitude on a mechanical computer. At the designated height, dive brakes automatically deployed, large, perforated panels under the wings that rotated perpendicular to the airflow. They dramatically increased drag, limiting dive speed and stabilizing the aircraft during the attack. Without them, the Stuka would become uncontrollable. German test pilots reported that with dive brakes deployed, the Stuka descended in an almost rail-like fashion. Steady, predictable, aimable. The aircraft became a gun platform moving through three-dimensional space. In training documents, Luftwaffe instructors emphasized, the U-87 does not fly during the dive. It falls under control. Your task is not to maneuver, but to aim.
The Spanish Civil War provided Nazi Germany with the perfect testing ground. In March 1937, 3 Ju-87A aircraft arrived at Tablada Airfield near Seville, assigned to the Condor Legion. The Spanish theater presented ideal conditions: minimal enemy air opposition, clear weather, and numerous tactical targets. German crews began methodically refining dive-bombing techniques against bridges, supply columns, and Republican defensive positions. Initial reports to Berlin praised the aircraft's accuracy, but noted vulnerability to ground fire during the dive. The solution? Attack in groups, saturate defenses, minimize time over target. On April 26, 1937, Stukas participated in the bombing of Guernica. While Heinkel He-111 bombers conducted the primary attack, Stuka crews refined their terror tactics. Dive bombing created panic beyond its destructive capacity. Civilians described screaming planes that fell from the sky like demons. By 1938, improved Ju-87B models arrived in Spain. These featured more powerful engines, refined dive brakes, and the fully developed Jericho sirens. Combat reports documented a phenomenon that would define the Stuka's reputation. Republican soldiers, upon hearing the approach of Stukas, abandoned positions before bombs fell. The psychological impact preceded the physical attack. German observers noted, effectiveness exceeds bomb tonnage delivered, enemy disruption disproportionate to actual damage. This observation would reshape Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. The Stuka wasn't merely a precision bomber. It was a terror weapon that created battlefield chaos through psychological warfare.
September 1st, 1939, 04:45 hours, Operation Fall Weiss, Case White, began. The German invasion of Poland. 300 Ju-87 Stukas of various units prepared for coordinated strikes across the front. The target priority list revealed the Stuka's intended role: bridges, communication centers, artillery positions, command posts, and troop concentrations immediately behind the front line. Not strategic bombing, tactical devastation. Stuka Geschwader II, Immelmann, attacked the vital Vistula River bridges near Dürschau. Flying in Ketten,
flights of 3 aircraft, the Stukas dove through light anti-aircraft fire. Of 6 targeted bridges, 5 were destroyed or damaged beyond use within the first hour. Polish defenders reported that the sound alone caused temporary paralysis. Men who had never experienced dive bombing described an overwhelming urge to flee, to dig deeper into foxholes, to abandon equipment and run. Training and discipline competed with primal fear. The Stuka's precision proved devastating. Polish artillery batteries, carefully camouflaged and emplaced, were eliminated one by one. Unlike horizontal bombers that carpet-bombed general areas, Stukas could identify and destroy individual guns. Major Oskar Dinort, commanding 3 Geschwader II, filed a report on September 3rd. Target: Polish artillery position. 8 guns in revetments 800 meters south of Knocklow. Dive angle 80 degrees. Release altitude 700 meters. Results: 6 direct hits confirmed. Position destroyed. Crew reports enemy personnel fleeing before bomb impact. The last detail was critical. The psychological effect worked. Soldiers heard the scream, saw the black silhouette diving impossibly steep, and ran before weapons hit. This wasn't cowardice. It was involuntary human response to a stimulus engineered to trigger panic. By September 6th, Polish forces were in general retreat. The Stuka played a central role. Not through tonnage dropped, the Luftwaffe's horizontal bombers delivered far more explosives, but through disruption. Every attempted Polish counterattack met screaming death from above. Warsaw experienced concentrated Stuka attacks from September 16 through 25. The capital's defenses included anti-aircraft batteries, and German crews learned a harsh lesson. The Stuka was vulnerable, slow, committed to its dive, unable to maneuver defensively. 13 Ju-87s were shot down over Warsaw. The losses shocked Luftwaffe planners, but the city surrendered and the myth of the Stuka, invincible, unstoppable, inevitable, was born.
May 10, 1940. Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The invasion of France and the Low Countries. The Luftwaffe fielded 380 operational Stukas, organized into 9 Stuka Geschwader, dive bomber wings. The mission: destroy Fortress Belgium's key defenses. Specifically, Fort Ibn Emael, considered the most modern, impregnable fortress in Europe. The fort's massive steel cupolas housed artillery that commanded vital bridges across the Meuse River. May 10th, dawn. STG-77 attacked Ibn Emael with specialized ordnance, 500-kilogram bombs, and experimental 1,000-kilogram max bombs. While Luftwaffe glider troops landed directly on the fort, Stukas pounded the superstructure. The coordinated assault demonstrated evolved Stuka tactics. Aircraft didn't attack individually, they dove in sequence. Stoffel strength, 9 aircraft in rapid succession. Bombs impacted every 15 seconds. Defenders experienced continuous screaming, continuous explosions, continuous terror. Belgian artillery crews abandoned their weapons. Not due to physical damage, many guns remained operational, but psychological collapse. After 20 minutes of continuous dive bombing, soldiers simply stopped fighting. Fort Ibn Emael surrendered within 24 hours. The impregnable fortress broken not by ground assault, but by aerial terror. The French campaign showcased the Stuka at its apex. German armored spearheads pushed deep into Allied territory, while Stukas served as flying artillery, destroying strongpoints ahead of panzer divisions. At Sedan, the crucial breakthrough point, Stukas of STG-2, STG-77, and STG-3 conducted the largest concentrated dive bombing attack in history. From 1300 to 1600 hours on May 13th, wave after wave attacked French defensive positions on the Meuse's west bank. French soldiers dug into prepared positions with artillery support should have repelled the assault, but they broke. The continuous screaming of diving Stukas, the precision impacts, the psychological pressure, it was unbearable. A French lieutenant recorded, "The sound is impossible to describe. It enters your bones. You cannot think. You cannot aim your weapon. You can only wait for the bomb to hit you.
And when it doesn't, another aircraft is already diving, and another, and another. We called it the Concert of Death. By May 15th, German forces had crossed the Meuse at multiple points. The French army began disintegrating. Not destroyed by force of arms, but shattered psychologically. The Stuka's effectiveness during the French campaign generated statistical analysis that revealed startling truths. Combat reports indicated that for every soldier killed by Stuka bombs, 10 to 15 fled their positions. The ratio of psychological casualties to physical casualties was unprecedented. Luftwaffe tactical evaluators concluded, the Ju-87 achieves military effects disproportionate to explosive tonnage through combined auditory, visual, and kinetic assault on enemy morale. Recommended employment: concentrated attacks on critical defensive positions immediately preceding ground assault. August 13, 1940. Adlertag. Eagle Day. The opening of the Luftwaffe's campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and achieve air superiority over Britain. 4 Stuka Geschwader were assigned to participate. Almost immediately, the Stuka's limitations became catastrophically apparent. Britain wasn't Poland. Britain wasn't France. Britain had integrated radar, experienced fighter pilots, and aircraft, Spitfires and Hurricanes, that could intercept attackers before they reached targets. August 16, SG-77 attacked Tangmere Airfield. 31 Ju-87s escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. RAF Hurricanes from No. 43 Squadron intercepted. In 7 minutes of combat, 9 Stukas were destroyed, 9 more damaged, for minimal damage to the airfield. The mathematics were brutal. A Hurricane at 320 miles per hour could overtake a diving Stuka easily. The Stuka's defensive armament, a single rear-facing machine gun, couldn't stop a fighter attacking from any other angle. August 18 proved catastrophic. SG-77 attacked RAF Thorney Island. No. 1522 Squadron Spitfires caught the formation. 16 Stukas shot down. 28 aircrew killed or captured. The entire Gruppe effectively destroyed in a single engagement. Stuka crews reported that British fighters showed no fear of the dive attack. They waited for the bombers to commit to their dives, then attacked during recovery when the Ju-87 was slowest and most vulnerable. Oberst Freiherr von Richthofen, commander of Fliegerkorps VIII, sent an urgent message to Luftwaffe High Command. Ju-87 operations over England unsustainable without complete fighter air superiority. Request withdrawal from operation until air dominance achieved. On August 19th, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring withdrew the Stukas from the Battle of Britain. The invincible terror weapon had been grounded, the myth shattered. The lesson was clear. The Stuka required air superiority to function. Against competent fighter opposition, its slow speed and poor maneuverability were fatal flaws. The weapon of psychological warfare could only terrorize those who couldn't fight back.
June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force in history, and the Stukas returned to their element. The Eastern Front was different. Soviet fighter opposition, though numerous, lacked the coordination and tactics of the RAF. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were less concentrated than in Britain, and Soviet forces, caught by surprise, were vulnerable to the Stuka's psychological warfare. STG-2, STG-77, and multiple other units operated across the vast front. Early reports confirmed what German commanders hoped. The Stuka remained effective when properly employed. But the Eastern Front also introduced a new Stuka variant that would achieve legendary status, the Ju-87G, the tank hunter. By 1942, German forces faced increasing numbers of Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks. These were heavily armored, immune to standard bombs unless hit directly. Luftwaffe officers requested a solution. Junkers engineers mounted 2 37mm BK 3.7 anti-tank cannons under the wings.
Each cannon carried 6-round magazines of tungsten-core armor-piercing rounds. The GI model Stuka became the Kanonvogel, cannon bird. The aircraft sacrificed bomb-carrying capacity and most of its speed. Maximum velocity dropped to 320 kilometers per hour, but it gained the ability to destroy tanks from above, attacking the thinnest armor, the turret roof, and engine deck. Oberstleutnant Hans-Ulrich Rudel became the master of this aircraft. More than any other pilot, Rudel demonstrated what the Stuka could achieve in skilled hands. Rudel's tactics were methodical: fly low, identify tank formations, select lead vehicle, approach from behind, attacking from the rear where the engine deck was most vulnerable, dive at 30 to 40 degrees, shallow, not the steep attacks of conventional Stukas, fire from 800 to 600 meters, short bursts, 2 to 3 seconds, pull up, repeat. Between 1942 and 1945, Rudel flew 2,530 combat missions. He destroyed, according to German records, 519 Soviet tanks, 700 trucks, 150 artillery pieces, 70 landing craft, 2 cruisers, a destroyer, a battleship, and 9 aircraft in air combat. These numbers seem impossible. Soviet records neither confirm nor fully deny them. What's certain? Rudel survived repeated shoot-downs, wounds, and crashes. He continued flying even after losing his right leg below the knee in 1945. Rudel's success demonstrated that the Stuka, properly employed by expert crews, remained lethal even as the war turned against Germany. But Rudel was exceptional. For average crews, the Eastern Front became increasingly deadly. By 1943, Soviet fighter regiments had improved dramatically. Yak-9s and Law-5s matched German fighters in performance. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses grew denser, and Soviet soldiers, hardened by 2 years of war, no longer broke at the sound of diving aircraft. Stuka losses mounted. Experienced crews died. Replacements arrived with minimal training. The psychological weapon that had terrorized Poland and France faced an enemy that refused to be terrorized.
By mid-1944, the Stuka was obsolete. Allied air superiority made daylight operations suicidal, yet Germany continued flying them because there was no alternative. The Luftwaffe had no other dedicated ground attack aircraft available in sufficient numbers. Stuka units transitioned to night operations. The same aircraft that once dove screaming in broad daylight now approached targets in darkness, attempting to avoid fighters. But night operations negated the Stuka's primary advantages, precision and psychological impact. Crews couldn't identify targets with accuracy. The scream of diving aircraft terrified no one in darkness. The weapon had become merely another light bomber, and not a particularly good one. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 effectively ended Stuka operations in Western Europe. Allied fighters, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, Typhoons controlled the skies. Any German aircraft that flew in daylight faced immediate attack. The few Stuka missions attempted over France resulted in massacres. Formations intercepted, aircraft shot down in flames, pilots killed before dropping weapons. The terror weapon had become prey. On the Eastern Front, Stukas continued operating until war's end, but under increasingly desperate conditions. By 1945, fuel shortages limited operations. Experienced pilots were dead. Replacements barely knew how to fly, much less conduct precision dive attacks. The final recorded Stuka combat missions occurred in early May 1945 during the defense of Berlin. Ju-87 pilots attacked Soviet armor advancing through the city's ruins. It was suicide. Most never returned. Production of the Ju-87 ceased in September 1944. Total built
approximately 6,500 aircraft of all variants. This was modest compared to other Luftwaffe types. Over 30,000 Bf-109 fighters were produced, but the Stuka's impact exceeded its numbers. The Jericho Trumpet deserves specific technical examination. It was, perhaps, the most successful psychological weapon ever engineered into an aircraft. The device was simple: a small, wind-driven propeller, 7 to 10 centimeters in diameter, mounted on a short shaft inside a cylindrical housing. As air flowed through the housing during the dive, the propeller spun. But the blades were deliberately designed with irregular shapes and angles. This irregularity caused oscillating air pressure variations, vibrations, that generated sound. The faster the airflow, the higher the frequency. As the Stuka accelerated during its dive, the sound rose in pitch. 2 sirens were mounted, one on each main landing gear spat. They were positioned to project sound downward and forward, directly toward the target. The sound waves combined, creating interference patterns that produced the characteristic wailing effect. German acoustic engineers tested various frequencies on volunteer subjects. They discovered that sounds between 1200 and 1800 Hz, approximately the frequency of a human scream, generated maximum stress response. The Jericho Trumpet was tuned to produce sounds within this range. As the Stuka dove, the siren frequency increased from approximately 1000 Hz at dive initiation to over 1500 Hz at maximum dive speed. Neurological research would later explain why this was effective. The human auditory system is evolutionarily tuned to respond to distress vocalizations, screams, cries, sounds indicating danger or pain. The Jericho Trumpet mimicked these frequencies almost perfectly. The result? Involuntary stress response, elevated heart rate, adrenaline release, cortisol flooding, cognitive function reduction. In military terms, reduced combat effectiveness before any weapon fired. Soviet and Allied studies after the war confirmed. Soldiers exposed to Stuka attacks showed measurable decreases in tactical decision-making, weapon accuracy, and unit cohesion during and immediately after attacks, even when bombs didn't hit nearby. Some German crews requested permission to remove the sirens. They claimed the devices reduced aircraft speed by approximately 5 to 10 kilometers per hour due to added drag. Luftwaffe Command denied these requests. The psychological value exceeded the speed loss. Later in the war, as the Stuka's effectiveness waned and surprise attacks became impossible, some pilots did remove the sirens. But by then, the sound had become so associated with the aircraft that Allied soldiers reported hearing the scream even when attacking aircraft weren't equipped with sirens, a psychological phenomenon called phantom perception.
Stuka pilots were a particular breed. They required skills different from fighter pilots or bomber crews. Dive bombing demanded precise spatial awareness. Pilots judged altitude, dive angle, airspeed, and target positions simultaneously while pulling G-forces that could cause blackouts. Early in the war, 10 to 15% of Stuka accidents resulted from pilot incapacitation during recovery. Training at dive bombing schools, primarily at Graz in Austria, emphasized gradual progression. New pilots began with 30-degree dives, then 45, then 60. Only after proving consistent accuracy were they cleared for 80-degree attacks.
Psychological screening selected for specific traits: comfort with altitude, ability to function under G-stress, calm decision-making under pressure, and, critically, absence of vertigo or spatial disorientation. Stuka pilots described the dive experience in remarkably consistent terms. The moment you roll inverted and pull through into the dive, the world inverts. The ground rushes up. The scream begins. Your aircraft, not you, is screaming. You're focused entirely on the sight. The red lines on the windscreen, the target must align. Everything else disappears. The rear gunner's experience was worse. Facing backward during the dive, watching the sky recede while knowing the ground approached unseen behind you. Many rear gunners requested transfer. Some broke psychologically. Obergefreiter Fritz Weber, radio operator with 2 by STG-77, described it, "During the dive, I couldn't see the target. I could only watch altitude indicators counting down. I heard the siren screaming. I felt the vibration. I waited for the release, the bombs dropping away. Then the pullout, G-forces crushing me into my seat. Every time I wondered if this was the dive we wouldn't recover from." Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most successful Stuka pilot, approached it differently. For Rudel, the dive was meditative. He described entering a state of intense focus where external awareness faded and only the target existed. "I didn't hear the siren during my dives. I didn't feel fear. I felt only purpose. Identify the target, set up the attack, execute. Everything else was irrelevant." This almost mechanical mindset made Rudel exceptional. He flew more combat missions than any Luftwaffe pilot, 2,530 confirmed sorties. He was shot down or forced to land 30 times. He survived crashes that should have killed him. On February 8, 1945, Soviet anti-aircraft fire hit Rudel's Ju-87 over East Prussia. Shrapnel severed his right leg below the knee. His rear gunner was killed instantly. Rudel flew the damaged aircraft back to German lines, landed, and walked, bleeding massively, to medical aid. After amputation, Rudel demanded to return to flight status. Within 6 weeks, wearing a prosthetic, he was flying combat missions again. He flew until war's end, escaping to the west to avoid Soviet capture. Rudel's story is extraordinary, but thousands of ordinary Stuka crews flew hundreds of missions each, facing death repeatedly. The casualty rate was severe. By war's end, average life expectancy for Stuka crews on the Eastern Front was estimated at just 120 combat missions, approximately 4 months of active service.
The Stuka represented German industrial philosophy of the 1930s, functional, simple, and mass-producible using conventional methods. Junkers factories at Dessau produced the majority of U-87s, but production was distributed to Weser Flugzeugbau in Berlin and later to occupied facilities in Eastern Europe as bombing damaged German factories. The aircraft's design facilitated relatively simple assembly. The fuselage was built in 2 halves, port and starboard, then joined along the centerline. Wings attached at 4 main bolts. The engine and landing gear were modular subassemblies bolted on. This modularity enabled rapid production, but also meant battle-damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly in field workshops. If a wing was destroyed, replace the entire wing. If the engine failed, swap in a new power plant. Entire Stukas were rebuilt from salvaged components. Production costs reflected this philosophy. In 1941, a single Ju-87 cost approximately 110,000 Reichsmarks, about $44,000 in contemporary American dollars. For comparison, a Bf-109 fighter cost about 80,000 Reichsmarks, while a Panzer IV tank cost 105,000 Reichsmarks.
The Stuka was relatively expensive for an aircraft, but its perceived effectiveness justified costs. Luftwaffe procurement officers calculated that a Stuka Gruppe, approximately 30 aircraft, could destroy more enemy armor and artillery than an entire artillery regiment. By 1943, material shortages forced production compromises. Aluminum allocations prioritized fighters. Stukas increasingly used non-strategic materials. Steel tubing replaced aluminum framing where possible. Wooden components substituted for metal in non-structural areas. Canvas fabric replaced metal paneling on control surfaces. These modifications degraded performance slightly, increasing weight, reducing speed, but kept production flowing. Germany needed ground attack aircraft desperately, and the Stuka, obsolete though it was, remained the only proven platform available in quantity. Worker productivity at Junkers plants revealed wartime pressures. In 1940, experienced German workers assembled a complete Ju-87 in approximately 5,000 man-hours. By 1944, using forced laborers from occupied territories and concentration camps, that figure increased to 7,000 man-hours while quality declined. Sabotage became endemic. Forced laborers deliberately weakened welds, left bolts loose, or damaged electrical systems in ways difficult to detect during inspection. Some Stukas suffered mysterious mechanical failures shortly after delivery, subtle acts of resistance that may have saved Allied lives. Allied strategic bombing targeted Junkers facilities repeatedly. The massive raid on Dessau in March 1945 destroyed much of the factory complex, killing thousands of workers, many of them prisoners who had no bomb shelters. Production effectively ceased, though Germany still had operational Stukas flying from surviving inventory.
Allied forces developed increasingly effective countermeasures against the Stuka as the war progressed. Initially, in Poland and France, confusion and fear dominated Allied response. But by 1941, experienced troops learned that the Stuka's scream, terrifying though it was, preceded impact by several seconds. This was time enough to take cover or, critically, to aim anti-aircraft weapons. British troops developed tactical responses during the North African campaign. When Stukas approached, designated anti-aircraft teams, often using captured German 88mm guns or British 40mm Bofors, would fire continuously into the predicted dive path. The goal wasn't to hit the diving aircraft, but to force pilots to deviate from their attack runs. This proved remarkably effective. Stuka bombing accuracy depended on steady, committed dives. Any evasive maneuvering, even slight, destroyed precision. Pilots who jinked to avoid flak often missed targets entirely. Soviet forces developed perhaps the most direct counter: overwhelming anti-aircraft density. By 1943, Soviet armies deployed quadruple-mounted 12.7mm DSHK machine guns in enormous numbers. These weapons, while ineffective against high-altitude bombers, were devastating against low-flying Stukas during their recovery phase. Soviet tactical doctrine specified, "Do not shoot at diving aircraft, shoot where they will be after recovery." Gunners aimed not at the Stuka during its dive, but at the predicted pull-out point. As the aircraft recovered, climbing and slow, it flew directly into concentrated fire. Fighter tactics evolved similarly. Allied pilots learned not to chase Stukas into their dives. The German aircraft could dive more steeply than most fighters, but to position themselves at recovery altitude. When the Stuka pulled out, stressed and slow, fighters attacked from the side or rear quarter. RAF pilots reported that Stukas were remarkably easy to shoot down if caught during recovery. They're committed, they can't maneuver, they can barely evade, and that rear gun is useless against a fighter attacking from below or the side. It's almost unsporting. Radar integration gave Allied forces advance warning. By 1944, Allied radar networks could detect incoming Stukas far enough in advance to vector fighters for interception before bombs dropped.
The Stuka's low speed made interception almost guaranteed. The psychological counter proved most important: familiarization. Once troops experienced Stuka attacks and survived, the terror diminished. Veteran units learned that the scream was theater. The bombs were deadly, yes, but no more so than artillery. Take cover, wait for impact, continue fighting. By 1944, Allied troops in Normandy often didn't even take cover during Stuka attacks if they had foxholes and the aircraft weren't directly overhead. The weapon that had broken French morale in 1940 barely disrupted American infantry in 1944. This habituation was fatal to the Stuka's effectiveness. A weapon that depended on fear couldn't function once soldiers stopped fearing it.
The WWII Stuka's influence extends far beyond its combat service. It established principles of psychological warfare that remain relevant. Modern military aircraft incorporate acoustic signatures as tactical considerations. The A-10 Thunderbolt II's GAU-8 Avenger cannon produces a distinctive deep brrrt sound that has become psychologically associated with devastating air support. While not deliberately engineered like the Jericho Trumpet, the psychological impact is similar. Apache and Cobra helicopters' rotor signatures create recognizable sounds that have become associated with imminent attack. Insurgent forces in Iraq and Afghanistan reported that the sound of approaching helicopters caused immediate behavioral changes, suppression of activity, abandonment of positions before weapons engaged. The drone warfare revolution has introduced new psychological dimensions. The constant presence of unmanned aerial vehicles creates persistent psychological stress. The uncertainty of when, not if, a strike might occur generates chronic anxiety that degrades combat effectiveness without kinetic action. Military psychologists term this signature fear, the psychological impact of distinctive weapon signatures that transcend their physical effects. The Stuka pioneered this concept at industrial scale. Precision strike weapons, laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided munitions fulfilled the Stuka's original promise: accurate delivery of ordnance against tactical targets. Modern aircraft achieve this from altitude, invulnerable to most ground defenses. The Stuka's concept succeeded. Its execution was limited by 1930s technology. Close air support doctrine still reflects lessons from Stuka employment. Modern military forces integrate air power directly with ground maneuver, using aircraft as mobile artillery to destroy strong points ahead of advancing troops. The Germans pioneered this at scale with the Stuka. NATO forces refined it in Iraq and Afghanistan with JDAMs and Hellfires. The psychological warfare dimension remains controversial. International humanitarian law increasingly questions weapons designed primarily to terrorize civilians. The Stuka, particularly during attacks on Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Belgrade, deliberately targeted civilian populations to create panic. This established precedent for strategic bombing campaigns that followed: the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The line between military necessity and terror bombing, first crossed systematically by Stukas, remains debated. The Stuka generated myths that persist 8 decades later. Some true, some exaggerated, some entirely false. Myth: the Stuka siren was audible from miles away. Reality: maximum effective range was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters under ideal conditions. Beyond this, the sound dissipated or became indistinguishable from engine noise. The terror effect required proximity. Myth: the Stuka could dive completely vertically at 90 degrees. Reality: maximum dive angle for most pilots was 80 to 85 degrees. True vertical dives were nearly impossible to recover from and generally fatal. Pilots who claimed 90-degree dives were likely estimating subjectively. During the dive, angles feel steeper than they are. Myth: Stukas were invincible in the early war years. Reality: even in Poland and France,
Stukas suffered losses to ground fire and fighters. German records show 31 U-87s lost in the Polish campaign, 156 lost during the French campaign. Not catastrophic, but far from invincible. Myth: Hans Ulrich Rudel personally destroyed 519 tanks. Reality: this figure comes from German claims, which were often inflated. Soviet records neither fully confirm nor deny these numbers. Modern historians estimate Rudel's actual kills at perhaps 300 to 400, still extraordinary, but not the superhuman total claimed. Truth: the Jericho Trumpet really did cause psychological breakdown. This is documented in Allied medical reports, post-combat assessments, and psychological studies. The sound genuinely produced measurable stress responses and combat effectiveness degradation. This wasn't propaganda. It was engineered psychological warfare. Truth: the Stuka required air superiority to survive. This is indisputable. Against competent fighter opposition, Stukas were slaughtered. The Battle of Britain proved this definitively. The aircraft's combat effectiveness correlated directly with friendly fighter dominance. Truth: the Stuka remained in service until war's end, despite obsolescence. Germany had no alternative. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was being developed for ground attack, but never replaced the Stuka in sufficient numbers. The Luftwaffe flew obsolete aircraft because it had nothing else.
Behind the statistics, 6,500 aircraft built, thousands of missions flown, were human beings who climbed into these machines knowing the odds. Stuka crew casualty rates varied dramatically by theater and period. During the Polish and French campaigns, losses were manageable, approximately 5 to 8% per month. Crews could reasonably expect to survive their tour. The Battle of Britain changed everything. During August 1940, Stuka units suffered 25 to 30% monthly losses. At these rates, statistically, every crew member would be killed or wounded within 4 months. The Eastern Front produced grinding attrition. Monthly loss rates averaged 12 to 15% from 1942 through 1944. Experienced pilots died. Replacements arrived with minimal training, sometimes as few as 30 hours in type, and died even faster. Oberleutnant Anton Korl, who served with SG-77 from 1942 to 1944, described the psychological toll. "We stopped learning names after a while. New pilots would arrive. We'd fly together once, maybe twice. Then they'd be gone. Shot down, crashed, captured. It was easier not to know them. Easier not to remember." The rear gunners, radio operators who manned the defensive machine gun, suffered particularly. Facing backward, they watched fighters approach. Their single machine gun was nearly useless. They were passengers in their own death. Survival strategies emerged. Experienced crews learned to read the battlefield. If fighter opposition was heavy, abort the mission. If flak was too dense, select alternate targets. Survival trumped mission completion. But German military culture emphasized duty above survival. Pilots who repeatedly aborted missions faced courts-martial for cowardice. The pressure to continue attacking, regardless of odds, killed men who might otherwise have lived. Post-war interviews with surviving Stuka veterans revealed deep psychological trauma. Many suffered from what would now be diagnosed as PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor guilt. The men who delivered terror carried it with them for decades. Fritz Weber, the radio operator quoted earlier, was shot down 3 times. He survived. His pilot died in the 3rd crash. Weber spent 40 years reliving those moments. "I still hear the siren. In my sleep, in quiet moments. The scream never leaves you. We made others hear it in terror. We heard it as our death song."
The Junkers U-87 Stuka was neither the wonder weapon German propaganda claimed nor the outdated failure post-war critics suggested. It was something more complex, a purpose-built instrument of tactical air warfare that achieved extraordinary success within narrow parameters. When conditions were right, air superiority, suppressed air defenses, unprepared enemies, The Stuka was devastatingly effective. It could destroy tactical targets with precision unmatched by contemporary bombers. It could break enemy morale through psychological warfare. It could enable rapid military victories. When conditions were wrong, contested airspace, prepared defenses, experienced opponents, the Stuka became a liability. Too slow, too vulnerable, too specialized. It couldn't adapt to circumstances outside its design envelope. The Stuka represented a fundamental military philosophy that wars could be won through shock and terror rather than attrition, that psychological impact could substitute for material destruction, that fear was a weapon as important as explosives. This philosophy worked initially. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in months. The Balkans were overrun. Each campaign validated the terror bombing concept. Each victory reinforced belief in psychological warfare. But it couldn't sustain total war. The Soviet Union absorbed the terror and continued fighting. Britain survived the psychological assault and adapted. The United States entered with material resources that overwhelmed tactical innovation. The Stuka's industrial and tactical limitations mirrored Germany's broader strategic failures: overspecialization, reliance on tactical surprise, inability to produce in sufficient quantity, failure to innovate as enemies adapted. By 1943, the Stuka was a symbol of Germany's declining position. Obsolete aircraft flown by undertrained crews against overwhelming opposition. The terror weapon that had announced Blitzkrieg's beginning became a relic, desperately employed as the Reich collapsed. Yet the Stuka's legacy transcends its combat record. It proved that psychological warfare could be engineered, that fear could be weaponized systematically, that human psychology was as valid a target as physical infrastructure. Modern military forces understand this. Every precision strike broadcast on social media, every distinctive weapons signature, every demonstration of overwhelming capability, these are descendants of the Stuka's psychological warfare doctrine. The scream of the U-87, the Jericho Trumpet's mechanical wail, became the 20th century's most recognizable sound of war. It entered collective memory. Film and media reproduced it endlessly. The sound became synonymous with German air power, with Blitzkrieg, with World War II itself.
May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The last Stukas sat abandoned on airfields across Europe. Some were captured intact. Most were destroyed by their own crews. Allied forces examined these aircraft with clinical interest. American and British engineers conducted technical evaluations. The reports praised the aircraft's sturdy construction and docile handling. They noted the ingenious automatic pull-out system. They dismissed the overall design as obsolete. But psychological warfare specialists studied the Jericho Trumpet intensely. Here was quantifiable evidence that acoustic psychological warfare worked. The principle was retained even as the aircraft was scrapped. A few Stukas survived to fly post-war. Several were restored for museums. Some appeared in films, their distinctive silhouette instantly recognizable decades after the war. The sound effects, even when artificially recreated, still carried psychological weight. Veterans of Stuka attacks, Polish, French, British, Soviet, American, carried memories forever. Many couldn't hear high-pitched sounds without experiencing anxiety. The conditioned response, engineered in German laboratories, persisted lifelong. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the Stuka's greatest proponent, spent post-war decades defending the aircraft's reputation and, implicitly, his own service. He wrote memoirs, consulted for military forces, became a controversial figure, celebrated by some as a tactical genius, condemned by others as an unrepentant Nazi.
Rudel died in 1982. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including former Luftwaffe personnel and, controversially, some neo-Nazi groups attempting to claim his legacy. His combat record remains unmatched. His moral legacy remains contested. The Stuka's final verdict is this: it was a weapon perfectly designed for wars that ended quickly through psychological shock. It excelled in short campaigns where enemy morale could be shattered before materializing full defensive capability. But World War II wasn't that war. It became a total war of industrial production, strategic depth, and sustained resistance. In such conflict, psychological weapons couldn't substitute for material strength. Terror couldn't replace tonnage. The Stuka's scream, which had broken armies in 1939 and 1940, became background noise by 1944. Soldiers learned, defenses adapted. The weapon that depended on shock lost its power once enemies stopped being shocked. Today, the handful of surviving Ju-87s in museums stand as monuments to a specific moment in military history, when engineers believed they could weaponize fear itself, when psychological warfare was industrialized, when the scream of diving aircraft announced a new era of warfare. The Stuka proved they were right. Fear could be weaponized. Psychological impact could be engineered. Terror could enable military victory. But it also proved the limits of this approach. Enemies adapt. Courage returns. And eventually, the screaming stops being terrifying. It becomes merely noise. Allied soldiers froze in fear when they first heard Germany's screaming Stuka. But they learned, they adapted, they survived, and ultimately, they won. The Stuka's scream, once the soundtrack of Germany's victory, became the sound of Germany's defeat. The terror weapon that enabled Blitzkrieg couldn't prevent catastrophe. At 390 kilometers per hour, with 1,200 horsepower and a mechanical scream engineered in laboratories, the Ju-87 Stuka rewrote the rules of psychological warfare. But wars aren't won by fear alone. The Stuka taught that lesson in blood and fire across Europe. The scream that once broke armies became a memory. The weapon that terrorized millions became a museum piece. Sometimes, even the most perfectly engineered fear isn't enough. The screaming has stopped, but the lessons remain.